Tonight on Talking Politics, in just a few short hours, the Democratic National Committee is poised to formally demote the storied New Hampshire primary, a move that would remake the political landscape in that state and maybe have a trickle-down effect here in Massachusetts, too. We'll size up the implications with a Granite State political reporter and a local political operative. But first, for better or worse, sports betting is now a reality in Massachusetts. The latest expansion of our booming gambling industry could pump millions of dollars in new revenue into the state's coffers. It's also a reminder of how radically policymakers' approach to this issue has changed in a relatively short time, from then House Speaker Sal DeMacy blocking casino gambling under then Governor Deval Patrick to current House Speaker Ron Mariano leading the sports betting charge last year. So how exactly did that massive shift occur, and what broader lessons might it hold about how laws do and don't get made on Beacon Hill? Joining me now to kick around those questions and talk about what might be next for gambling in Massachusetts are GBH News' State House reporter Katie Lannon and Peter Kadzis, GBH News' political editor. Hello to both of you. So, Katie, I'm not urging people to go out and place bets on sports events, but hypothetically speaking, if I wanted to get some action on the next Celtics game, what would I do to try my luck?
So the key word there is go out, like you said. It's only so far being offered in the state's 3 casinos, so you'd have to make the trip to, probably from here, Everett, but you could also go out to Plainville or Springfield where the casinos are.
Both beautiful this time of year, yeah.
Scenic throughout Massachusetts right now on this very frigid day. And you know, they have kind of machine-operated kiosks and in-person windows where you can place your bet. You have plenty of sports to choose from. It is a cash business, not a credit card situation. Credit card bets are forbidden under the law.
Yeah.
And there are plenty of options once you get there, windows and kiosks available. There are folks you can talk to kind of explain what's going on there. The rules and problem gambling messaging are supposed to be kind of clearly available throughout. So if you walk in there and you don't know what you're doing, it should be explained to you. Each of the 3 casinos has their own rules. You, as the gambler, will not be seeing the tax that the state collects. It's not like the sales tax where you'll get hit with an extra cost. The state will collect its revenue on the other side from the operators of the betting.
Oh, that's interesting. I have to ask you, is there any reason that they did it that way, that you, the gambler, do not see the state
The tax is on the revenue collected, not on the wager itself.
Okay.
Yeah.
Peter Kadzis, at the start I mentioned Sal DeMacy. I remember you editing the Boston Phoenix and me being a reporter there when DeMacy was basically saying to Patrick, no, we're not going to do casino gambling on my watch. And he was very effective in leading the opposition there. How did we get from Sal DeMacy to Ron Mariano?
Well, for starters, Sal DeMacy, who was very moralistic about gambling, was indicted for federal political corruption charges, and that removed him from the scene. Bob DeLeo, his successor, was less doctrinaire about it. And the current House Speaker is a realist. You know, it was a matter of personalities, as so much of politics often is. Remove one personality, put a different one in, you have a very different political terrain.
Is it in any sense a reflection, this shift in the House that you talked about, personality driven, but is it also a reflection of the evolution of the House? I mean, I think of, in large part from reading your coverage, Katie, or listening to your coverage, I think of the House as becoming more progressive than it used to be, less automatically locked to business interests. I don't know if that coincides with a shift on gambling. So maybe I just talked myself out of the point.
No, I don't disagree with anything you say. The thing about the House of Representatives is you have to understand they can do whatever they want as long as it has enough votes. And I think, let me give you an example. About 8 years ago, you know, some shady / perverted character was caught taking pictures up a woman's skirt.
I remember that.
You know, the upskirt photo. Well, within roughly 36 hours, the state had banned upskirt photography, which is a good thing. But there's a radical clear-cut example of how Beacon Hill can move quickly when it doesn't want to. I'm not so sure the mix in the House and all, everything you said is fine, and that shades the way things go.
But maybe doesn't drive it.
Yeah,
in this
it's
case.
money. You know, we need the money. Now, personally, I'm opposed to gambling, but if you're going to have it to produce revenue, you should have, you know.
Go all in.
Yeah,
We've
once we
got
went
casino.
once we went with the lottery, you should just go all in.
That's a point I remember from the casino gambling debate. We do happen to have the state lottery that you see and have a chance to access pretty much everywhere. Katie, Peter mentioned revenue and the lure of revenue for lawmakers as they were hammering this out. How much money is this going to bring in for the state?
We are looking at estimates in the tens of millions of dollars annually, probably the $60 million range, which is no small chunk of money, right? That's substantial. But when you look at it in the context of a $50+ billion annual
Yeah.
state budget, the new tax approved at the ballot last year is projected to bring in about $1 billion
That
next
was the
fiscal
point
year.
of comparison I was thinking
Yeah,
of too.
it's not a make or break, but I think, you know, budget writers are looking at maybe the possibility of leaner times coming up for the state, and in that case, it does count.
Given that the projected revenue is relatively modest compared to other revenue sources, how much concern was there among lawmakers about the possible negative consequences of bringing this new gambling option to people who might have a problem with it as the debate played itself out?
That's a really interesting thing to, I think, explore, because you didn't really hear as much of that as you did when we were talking about casino gambling, 10 years plus ago. You, even as recently as 2016, in a debate about whether the lottery should be allowed to go online, people were bringing up, the perils of gambling addiction and whether it's ethical for the state to be collecting revenue off of that. But this time around, I think there is more of a acceptance in a way of the fact that gambling is happening, and we, the state, might as well be getting the money that's either going to the black market or to Rhode Island or New Hampshire.
I have a hunch you might have anticipated what Peter wanted to say.
I was going to say that, but I have another analogy. We're also selling pot for profit and taxing the proceeds. It's from when I was in my early 20s. I mean, it's just remarkable. The lottery, gambling, pot.
Things perceived as vices are no longer anathema.
And
right?
I know conservative people who said, well, I'm not wild about legalizing pot, but look at all the tax revenue. I would argue, what took Massachusetts so long to go to sports gambling? We're the 33rd in the nation. Now, I'm not suggesting we should have been first. And again, I think the state should be funding its operation through straightforward, legitimate taxes. But the people don't agree with me.
But when you got more than half the country doing it does make it harder to oppose it. I want to ask each of you in tandem, and you feel free to hop in first, whoever wants to, but Peter brought up the upskirting law that was passed really quickly after this really revolting incident a few years back. There are some big items that are still on the legislature's to-do list that didn't make it over the goal line, to use a sports metaphor, last session. Tax relief, obviously a big one. Katie, you mentioned to me when we were talking before, the revenge porn bill. Mm-hmm. They couldn't hammer out an agreement on that. They are still trying to wrap their arms around the incredibly high cost of childcare in Massachusetts and come up with a legislative fix for that. Is there some sort of a bigger takeaway in the fact that this got done when those things have not? Or am I looking again for deep meaning where there might not be any?
I think one thing that does come into play here is that this is something the House Speaker really wanted to get done, and former Governor Baker was on board with it as well. And you kind of often see the House, the Senate, and the governor as this like three-legged stool, kind of all playing off each other. And when you have two of them aligned, it can be easier to get something across. Now, the Senate President, Karen Spilka, was making a lot of the same points you just made, Adam. Every time she was asked, when's the Senate going to do sports betting, she would kind of counter with, well, when's the House going to do mental health reform? So that is, even in Beacon Hill, this took 4 years to get done, which is either fast or slow, depending on how
Right.
you look at it.
Right, depending on what you're comparing it to. Did you want to add to Katie's take there?
Well,
Is that what it comes down to?
Yeah, I think Katie's right. The 3 or 4 years is, to my way of looking at it, fairly standard. It's easy, as I just did earlier in the show, to generalize, especially about the House. But each piece of legislation, has a life of its own. It's like looking through a microscope at a petri dish, and you see all the stuff swimming around. Upskirt photos, quick life. Sports betting, something else. Mental health, much longer. It's a mysterious place.
One more question on gambling, or gaming, as some like to call it, not me. And then I want to ask both of you about Maura Healey's T-Ride before we wrap up. But Katie, will there be more expansion of the gambling industry, or have we kind of maxed out on where we can go?
Well, the immediate thing is there will be online sports betting launching as part of that same law, online or mobile, depending on which term you want to use.
That'll be interesting.
Slated to possibly go live in March, depending on how the Gaming Commission does with the vetting of the operators there, who are not quite as known quantities, right, as the existing casinos.
Is that where Barstool Sports is trying to get in on
Barstool Sports is also aligned with Plainridge, the Plainridge Park Casino in Plain.
It's hard to keep track of all the multiple entities.
And we'll see, I think, parallel to that, the state treasurer, Deb Goldberg, for years has been asking the legislature to let her offer the lottery online, which, we talked about revenue. That's a $1 billion source of local aid.
Well, to echo Peter from a little bit ago, if I were Deb Goldberg, I'd be saying, well, come on, let's do this. I got to make this thing work. I got to maximize revenues for the state. If all these other things are acceptable, why not this? All right, on to Maura Healey and her, I believe, 2-stop ride on the Red Line, right? She did not take it from her home in Cambridge, but she hopped on it downtown, got off relatively quickly. Do you two think that it was valuable for Maura Healey to take this ride relatively early in her tenure? Among other things, it's a contrast with Charlie Baker, who had to be kind of nagged over the course of the better part of 8 years to ride on the T. Is this meaningful, or is it sort of an easy photo op for the governor?
It can be both, right? It's an easy photo op. It's certainly, more people walk that commute between Park Street and South Station than hop on the T for it. But I think you're right. I think she's trying to set herself up in big picture contrast to Charlie Baker, saying she wants to be more transparent, saying that she knows the buck stops with her when it comes to the T. And, we'll have to see how that plays out, but it's definitely a messaging strategy early on. And, meanwhile, Lieutenant Governor Kim Driscoll does take the commuter rail from her home in Salem.
That's a good point.
Not daily, but every now and then. So there is a, transit riding presence in the administration.
I'm glad you mentioned Driscoll's habits. Peter, you get the last word here?
Well, I hear Netflix is considering a series, 90 Seconds on the Red Line. I mean, there's an economic plus. No, it was a photo op. It was a smart photo op. And I'll say what I've said the few times I've been on here since Healey's been elected governor. She's doing a very good job of slowly but surely establishing herself and her agenda. So this was another smart move.
All right, Peter Kadzis, Katie Landon, thank you both.
Thank you.
Next up, members of the Democratic National Committee are poised to approve a new 2024 primary election schedule at their winter meeting tomorrow, shaking up the decades-long tradition of New Hampshire heading to the polls first. The new calendar, which was proposed by President Biden a few months back, would put South Carolina first on February 3rd, with both New Hampshire and Nevada following 3 days later. Earlier this week, the DNC's Southern Caucus came out in support of the plan, but it's still getting a lot of pushback from top New Hampshire Democrats who've said they have no plans to abide by the decision. So what's going to happen next? And what would a demoted New Hampshire primary, at least on the Democratic side, mean for politicians and voters here in Massachusetts? I'm joined now by Joe Caiazzo, a former senior staffer for Bernie Sanders' presidential campaigns. He's also worked on the campaigns, tell me if I've got this right, Joe, of Hillary Clinton, Elizabeth Warren, Seth Moulton, and others. Are we correct?
Yes.
Good. And Josh Rogers, he's a senior political reporter and editor for New Hampshire Public Radio, New Hampshire's public radio station. Thank you both for being here. Josh, let me start with you. As I've read coverage of the DNC deliberations that have been leading to this change likely being implemented, it seems like it's pretty much the entire Democratic establishment versus a couple of dissenters from New Hampshire. I'm wondering, in the state of New Hampshire, is there anyone who's saying, you know, guys, we need to sort of accept the fact that this change is going to be made and embrace it and try to make the most of it? Or in New Hampshire as well, are people just saying, no, this is unacceptable and we're not going to go along with it?
I think it depends on who you're talking about. Most people in New Hampshire don't pay a huge amount of attention to this. Obviously, people involved in politics, Democratic politics, and Republican politics would like New Hampshire to retain its spot in the calendar. We do have a law that was passed here that requires New Hampshire to hold an election a week before any similar nominating contest. And that law is going to be followed regardless of what the DNC does. But in terms of people who really have their blood up about this, it's people connected to politics. And, you know, it's worth remembering that we are still a ways away from 2024. And we'll see what's happened. I mean, New Hampshire's tended to rely on being more nimble than other states who've sought to leapfrog it in the queue in years past. This is a different sort of challenge to New Hampshire's place in the calendar, obviously coming from a president, coming from the party itself. But obviously, you know, your read on the upshot of these DNC Rules Committee meetings is accurate. It's New Hampshire out there saying we need to go first, and everyone else saying that, you know, we think President Biden's proposed calendar is a good idea that reflects the values and demographics of the Democratic Party.
I should probably mention here that the new calendar that we talked about, New Hampshire would only have that relatively privileged spot, as I understand it, if they implemented early voting and also repealed the law that you just mentioned, Josh, which says that they have to go a week before any other state. And my sense is that those things are unlikely to happen. Given that that law is probably going to remain on the books, Josh Rogers, what is going to happen maybe in 2024, maybe looking ahead to the next contested primary, if Biden runs again in 2024, what's it going to look like if New Hampshire says, no, we're going to go ahead and go first, despite what the DNC told us?
Well, all of what it looks like and all of what New Hampshire has looked like historically is dependent on candidates determining that it's in their interest to vie here. I mean, obviously, if President Biden runs again in 2024 and it's looking strong, you know, it's going to be individual calculus of potential challengers, whether they decide to participate. I mean, poll out last week here from New Hampshire showed 2/3 of Democratic primary voters here don't want the president to seek a second term. But if you're one of the candidates who might challenge him, should he run again, you know, do you want to run in New Hampshire? Obviously, on the one hand, winning a primary or strong showing here would be something that would arguably build momentum. But if, and in keeping with what some members of the Rules and Bylaws Committee seem to be arguing, is that New Hampshire's primary is a sort of vestigial privilege that, you know, is sort of out of touch and potentially racist given the demographics of the state. Do you want to run and then, you know, have to vie in other states where running in New Hampshire might seem to be perceived as hostile to, you know, the non-white voters in the Democratic primary electorate?
That is a calculus that I'm fascinated to watch moving forward. Joe Caiazzo, you were, I believe, Bernie Sanders' state director in 2019 in the run-up to the 2020 primary, obviously.
Correct.
What are your thoughts as you watch this play out? Are you finding yourself preemptively mourning the demise of the traditional New Hampshire primary as we've known it, or not?
So I am completely and fully in favor of keeping New Hampshire to be the first in the nation.
Why?
Let me tell you why. I have three big reasons. The first of which is the state really gives every candidate the opportunity to go coffee shop to coffee shop, living room to living room, having these one-on-one conversations, building the relationships with the voters, and they let you build your grassroots organization. The other thing is the state of New Hampshire is absolutely a swing state. Though the entire congressional delegation are full of Democrats, you've got a Republican governor who is wildly popular. You have a state legislature which has gone back and forth over the last couple cycles. These voters are up for grabs. We've seen what happens when we don't get them. Back in 2000, if Al Gore had won the state of New Hampshire, he would have been the president. There is a lot there. And the third final point, which I think is fascinating, is the state essentially acts like a laboratory for a bunch of these Democratic primary campaigns. You see some folks who don't go and perform as well make slight tweaks to go on to win the nomination, right? You think Secretary Clinton in 2016, you think Biden in 2020. I think
Bill
those
Clinton
three,
back in the
Bill
day
Clinton,
didn't win, but managed to spin his
look, and I think the travesty here is if they take that away, you are taking away the opportunity for these candidates to really build a relationship, to voters, which goes and addresses the two following points that I had.
I want to double back to a
Yep.
couple of the points you raised in just a moment, but first I want to ask you, what would, if New Hampshire Democrats, or if Democratic candidates in the next contested primary are maybe wary of going into New Hampshire to campaign for the reasons that Josh mentioned, what would the implications be for the political class, broadly speaking,
Sure.
here in Massachusetts? Because there's operatives like you who are based here. There are politicians, Massachusetts politicians, who have a habit of going up north to help out their preferred candidate, maybe make alliances, increase their profile. Obviously, there are media outlets, commercial media outlets that benefit from advertising. So would there be a negative trickle-down effect in Massachusetts, do you think?
Sure. I mean, look, there is a storied history of Democratic operatives cutting their teeth up in New Hampshire who go on to play massive roles at the state, local, and federal, type of level for decades. The other part of it is, I think, Josh, tell me if I'm wrong here, approximately 80% of the state of New Hampshire is in the Boston media market. So every time someone comes through here for a fundraiser or something like that, they are going and reaching up there into New Hampshire. I mean, the Boston Globe just went and opened a Concord office, right? Mm-hmm. You essentially have a media market that has gone and spilled over. The other part of it is, if you look at the region holistically, on the heels of New Hampshire, you've got the state of Massachusetts, the state of Vermont, who have been a part of Super Tuesday, followed traditionally a week or so later by the state of Maine, followed 3 weeks later to a month later by the state of Connecticut and the state of Rhode Island. By coming to this neck of the woods early on, it gives you the opportunity to go and move around this part of the country, to go and build these serious organizations that give you staying power. And I think we saw that in 2016 with Bernie, where, he laid the groundwork up in New Hampshire, which gave him the runway to then be a part of this conversation up through the convention.
I'm glad you brought it out regionally, so we weren't just talking, as I wanted to, New Hampshire and Massachusetts. Josh, Marianne Williamson, the author, and I think I can call her a spiritual impresario, is already talking about utilizing the back and forth over the New Hampshire primary status to make an insurgent bid challenging Biden in New Hampshire in 2024. Just by way of a reminder, and because it's fun to go back and look at this, I want to roll a little bit of Marianne Williamson in the presidential debates, an NBC presidential debate in the last cycle.
Donald Trump is not going to be beaten just by insider politics talk. He's not going to be beaten just by somebody who has plans. He's going to be beaten by somebody who has an idea what this man has done. This man has reached into the psyche of the American people, and he has harnessed fear for political purposes. So, Mr. President, if you're listening, I want you to hear me, please. You have harnessed fear for political purposes, and only love can cast that out. So sir, I have a feeling you know what you're doing. I'm going to harness love for political purposes.
I had forgotten until I watched that clip this morning the extent to which she really livened up the debates the last time around. But that being said, I believe she got about 0% of the vote in the New Hampshire primary. Do you think, Josh, there's a possibility that if New Hampshire insists on going first, as you say it's going to, if more established candidates stay away because they don't want to be seen as going against a party-wide initiative involving racial equity, that it's going to become a sideshow dominated by fringe candidates like Williamson?
Oh, well, I think that's a possibility, and we'll see how strong Biden appears to be. I mean, there certainly is a space for somebody. You look at how poorly he did here the last time he ran. I mean, he's run for president 3 times. The only time he actually made it to primary day was in the last cycle, and he was already in South Carolina by the time the votes were being counted. So he's never done well here. But whether or not New Hampshire becomes essentially like the fringe candidates debate that they have at the Historical Society every campaign cycle, I think is an interesting question. I mean, there's a lot of time, though. I mean, that's one thing the Democrats here, leaders are banking on, that there's a lot of time. But if you've been paying attention, there is no indication that there's likely to be much sympathy for New Hampshire at the DNC level.
Yeah. Go ahead. You wanted to hop
I just
in?
wanted to jump in on that. Look,
Please.
I think at the end of the day, Joe Biden has been a tremendous president. He has put the needs of working families of this country ahead of everything else, and he's succeeded on this. And I think in the event that someone does decide to go and primary him, it will be dismissed quickly. Even by Democrats right now who are waffling in their support, they're going to look at this and they're going to say, you know what? When it comes to prescription drugs, when it comes to climate action, when it comes to infrastructure, Joe Biden has succeeded for us.
So you don't see there, you don't, as you look ahead, imagine a sort of a Kennedy versus Carter type primary unfolding at all? Okay.
Not one bit.
I want to ask each of you if it's possible, and feel free, whichever one wants to respond first, go ahead. I'm wondering if it might be the case that New Hampshire is missing an opportunity here, the New Hampshire Democratic establishment might be missing an opportunity here. Obviously, they couldn't get New Hampshire to repeal that first in the nation law because they just don't have the control required to do it right now. But when I think back to the last primary cycle, you mentioned this, Josh, Biden struggled in New Hampshire, struggled mightily, and then South Carolina became especially important. I still remember that day or couple day span when all the challengers to Biden were dropping out and getting behind him to derail Sanders. Isn't there a case to be made for going a little bit later and being more decisive rather than going absolutely first when it comes to primaries, just so you can say, look at us, we went first, just like we always do, and ceding a bit of influence? Josh, let's start with you, actually, and then you can hop in, Joe.
Well, I mean, if you cite the last primary, I mean, South Carolina was the decisive factor
Exactly.
there, really. And they did not go first.
Right.
So, you know, obviously here, it's law, it's fetish, it's sort of like woven into, and, you know, even if it wasn't really true, we obviously in some ways always went second behind the caucuses, at least in modern times.
Yeah,
So,
but those are weird, and I'm half
yes.
kidding and half serious.
So I don't know. I think it's an open question about which place in the calendar actually makes you more relevant. I do think one thing you can say on behalf of the New Hampshire primary, and Joe alluded to this, is that there is a culture, and I wouldn't make the case it's a culture that you know, spans a huge swath of the electorate, but there are people who participate, put the candidates through their paces. There is an infrastructure for retail campaigning that does create a more level playing field for challengers than may exist elsewhere.
Joe, you're going to get the last word here, but couldn't the dynamic that Josh just mentioned, that you brought up, the coffee, you know, politics on a human scale, you can go out, work small rooms, couldn't you go ahead and do all that as a candidate in New Hampshire if you were going after, if the state was going after South Carolina rather than before it?
I think you certainly could, but I think part of the but I think part of the push and part of why it's so incredibly powerful is that all eyes of the country are on the state of New Hampshire. So every coffee shop, every school gym, every single living room is meaningful. It is thoughtful. People track the crowd sizes. People track how big your delegation is at a parade. People track the speech you give at a Democratic state convention.
Yep.
I think the way the state of New Hampshire has set up this primary has been tremendous. I think the party infrastructure has been outstanding for candidates to function in. And I think the voters up there expect to have that conversation with everyone who comes through.
I'll be honest with you, I love, as a Boston area journalist, being able to go up and see these candidates early on in the process, up close and personal. And I will be fascinated to see what happens when it's the state of New Hampshire against the Democratic Party in a cycle or two or three. Joe Caiazzo, Josh Rogers, thank you both.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
That's it for tonight, but do come back next week. And as always, please tell us what you think. The email is talkingpolitics@wgbh.org. The website is gbhnews.org/talkingpolitics. Or you can find me on Twitter @RileyAdam. For now, thanks as always for watching, and good night.